What if I told you that one of the most heavily regulated products in America is something sitting under your kitchen sink right now? Every day, millions of Americans grab a bottle of glass cleaner, disinfectant spray, floor cleaner, or bathroom solution without giving it a second thought. It looks simple. A plastic bottle. A colorful label. Maybe a fresh scent and a promise to leave your home spotless. But behind that ordinary bottle is an invisible system that most consumers never see. Before a cleaning product ever reaches a store shelf, it may pass through layers of legal requirements, documentation, testing standards, labeling rules, ingredient reviews, and compliance procedures that can take months to complete and cost companies thousands or even tens of thousands of dollars. And the surprising part is that many of these requirements have nothing to do with making the product work better. They exist because one wrong ingredient, one unsupported marketing claim, or even one line of text printed incorrectly on a label can create serious legal problems for a manufacturer. The average shopper sees a cleaning product as a household item. Regulators see it very differently. Depending on what the product claims to do, it can trigger an entirely different set of rules, responsibilities, and oversight requirements. And that's where things start to get interesting. Because while consumers compare prices, scents, and brands, companies are fighting a completely different battle behind the scenes. A battle against paperwork, compliance costs, regulatory risk, and legal exposure. In fact, some entrepreneurs discover that creating an effective cleaning formula is actually the easy part. The real challenge begins after the formula is finished. And that's because hidden behind every successful cleaning product in America is a series of gatekeepers standing between an idea and a legal product. Most people never know they exist. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on that invisible system to discover who those gatekeepers are, why they matter, and how they quietly control what can and cannot end up inside the cleaning products Americans use every single day. To understand the first gatekeeper, imagine an entrepreneur named Michael Carter. He has spent months developing what he believes is the perfect cleaning formula. The product works. It removes stains. It smells great. Friends and family love it. At this point, most people assume the hard part is over. Michael certainly did. But when he began researching what it would actually take to sell that product in the United States, he discovered a reality that almost nobody talks about. The government does not care whether your product came from a multinational corporation or a startup operating out of a small warehouse. The moment you decide to sell it to the public, you enter a completely different world. A world governed by definitions, classifications, and legal categories. And this is where the first gatekeeper appears. Before regulators ask what is inside your product, they ask a much simpler question. What exactly is it? That sounds obvious until you realize that a single sentence on a label can completely change how a product is viewed. If a cleaner simply removes dirt, it may fall into one category. But if it claims to kill germs, eliminate bacteria, or disinfect surfaces, it can suddenly trigger an entirely different level of regulatory scrutiny. The formula inside the bottle might be almost identical, yet the legal obligations can become dramatically different. Michael quickly learned that words have consequences. Every claim printed on packaging creates expectations that companies must be prepared to support. The phrase powerful cleaner sounds simple to consumers. To compliance professionals, it raises questions. Can you prove that claim? How was it tested? What evidence exists? What standards were used? Suddenly, selling a cleaning product is no longer just about chemistry. It becomes a matter of documentation and proof. This first gatekeeper exists to answer one critical question. Is the company accurately representing what the product does? And for many new manufacturers, this is where the first major surprise occurs. They discover that before regulators evaluate ingredients, before testing begins, and before products reach store shelves, the language itself becomes part of the compliance process. Because in this industry, a product is not only judged by what is inside the bottle. It is also judged by every promise printed on the outside. Once Michael understood that every claim carried legal weight, he assumed the next step would be straightforward. If the wording was accurate and the product performed as advertised, surely that would be enough. But that assumption led him directly to the second gatekeeper. Because regulators are not only interested in what a company says a product can do. They also want to know whether the product can be used safely by the public. And that question opens an entirely new layer of complexity. A cleaning formula is really a combination of ingredients, each with its own properties, risks, handling requirements, and regulatory considerations. Some ingredients may be widely accepted and commonly used across the industry. Others may require additional review, restrictions, or specific labeling language. What surprised Michael was how much information needed to exist before anyone could confidently place a product into the hands of consumers. It was no longer enough to know that the formula cleaned effectively. He had to understand how ingredients behaved during storage, transportation, and normal household use. Could the product remain stable on a shelf for months? Would temperature changes affect performance? Were there specific handling instructions that needed to appear on packaging? The deeper he looked, the more he discovered that compliance is built on evidence. Every answer requires documentation. Every statement requires support. Every ingredient creates questions that must eventually be addressed. This is why large manufacturers maintain entire teams dedicated to regulatory affairs, quality assurance, and product stewardship. These professionals spend their days reviewing ingredient data, monitoring regulatory changes, and ensuring products continue meeting evolving requirements. Most consumers never see this hidden infrastructure. They simply see a finished bottle sitting on a retail shelf. But behind that bottle may be years of industry knowledge, technical review, supplier documentation, and internal verification processes. For Michael, this realization changed everything. He entered the industry believing success depended on creating a better cleaner. He was beginning to understand that success also depended on creating a product that could withstand scrutiny. Because before regulators evaluate how well something works, they first want confidence that it can be sold responsibly. And that brings us to the next gatekeeper. The stage where assumptions are no longer enough, where opinions carry little value, and where companies must begin proving their claims with measurable evidence. The third gatekeeper is where many entrepreneurs experience their first real shock. Up to this point, Michael Carter had spent most of his time focusing on formulation, packaging, and regulatory research. But now he was entering a phase where assumptions were no longer accepted. Everything had to be verified. This is the world of testing, validation, and documented proof. On the surface, the process sounds simple. If a product works, test it and move forward. In reality, the situation is far more complicated. Companies are expected to understand not only whether a product performs well on the day it is manufactured, but whether it continues performing weeks or months later under real-world conditions. A bottle may sit in a warehouse during summer heat. It may spend days inside delivery trucks. It may remain on a retail shelf for months before reaching a customer. The question is no longer whether the product works. The question becomes whether it works consistently. That single difference creates an entire industry of laboratories, consultants, technical specialists, and quality assurance systems. Michael learned that manufacturers often conduct stability evaluations to understand how formulas behave over time. They review packaging compatibility to ensure containers and ingredients work together properly. They analyze performance data to confirm that marketing claims remain accurate. Every test generates records. Every record becomes part of a growing compliance trail. And that trail matters because if questions ever arise in the future, companies need evidence showing how decisions were made. What surprised Michael most was not the complexity. It was the cost. Even relatively straightforward validation work can require specialized expertise, third-party services, and extensive documentation. A product that appears simple to consumers may already have thousands of dollars invested in testing and verification before a single bottle is sold. Large brands absorb these expenses through scale. Smaller companies often face difficult decisions about budgets, timelines, and priorities. Yet they still cannot afford to ignore the process. Because the purpose of testing is not simply to satisfy regulators. It is to reduce uncertainty. It helps manufacturers understand their own products before those products reach the market. By this point, Michael was beginning to see a pattern. Every gatekeeper seemed connected to the same principle. Trust. Regulators want evidence they can trust. Retailers want products they can trust. Consumers want brands they can trust. And proving that trust requires far more than a good idea. It requires systems, records, and documentation. Which leads directly to the next gatekeeper, where even a perfectly tested product can run into serious trouble because of something most people rarely pay attention to, the label. At first glance, a product label looks like a marketing tool. Bright colors, attractive branding, and carefully chosen words designed to capture attention. That is exactly how Michael Carter viewed it when he first started building his company. He assumed the label's primary purpose was to help customers understand what they were buying. What he discovered instead was that the label functions as one of the most legally sensitive parts of the entire product. In many cases, regulators may spend more time evaluating the information printed on the bottle than the design itself. That is because every word communicates something. Every statement creates an expectation. Every claim carries responsibility. A company cannot simply write whatever sounds persuasive. If a label suggests a product performs a specific function, there must be evidence supporting that statement. If instructions are provided, they must be accurate. If warnings are necessary, they must be visible and understandable. Even ingredient disclosures, usage directions, storage recommendations, and contact information can become important pieces of the compliance puzzle. Michael quickly realized that the label was not merely packaging. It was a legal document attached to every unit sold. A phrase that seems harmless during a marketing meeting can trigger difficult questions during a compliance review. What exactly does that claim mean? How was it validated? Can the company demonstrate its accuracy? Does the wording create expectations beyond what the product was designed to do? These questions become even more important when products are sold across large retail networks, online marketplaces, and multiple states. The bigger the distribution footprint becomes, the more exposure a company faces. One unclear statement can create confusion. One unsupported claim can attract scrutiny. One overlooked detail can force expensive revisions after thousands of units have already been produced. For established brands, entire departments often review packaging before products ever reach the market. Legal teams, regulatory specialists, marketing professionals, and quality assurance personnel may all examine the same label from different perspectives. To an outsider, that level of review can seem excessive. To industry veterans, it is considered normal. By now, Michael understood that success in this industry was not about moving quickly. It was about avoiding costly mistakes. And nowhere was that lesson more obvious than on the label. Because while consumers focus on what a product promises, companies must focus on every consequence those promises create. Yet even after solving the challenges of formulation, testing, and labeling, another obstacle remained. One that makes the regulatory landscape even more complicated. The rules do not always stop at the federal level. Just when Michael Carter thought he was beginning to understand the regulatory landscape, he encountered another reality that many first-time manufacturers underestimate. The United States is not a single regulatory environment, operating under one universal set of rules. It is a network of federal agencies, state governments, local requirements, and evolving compliance expectations that can overlap in unexpected ways. From a distance, the market looks unified. A company develops a product, sells it nationwide, and reaches customers from California to Florida. But behind the scenes, businesses often face a more complicated challenge. Different states may impose additional requirements, reporting obligations, ingredient restrictions, environmental standards, or disclosure expectations beyond what exists at the federal level. For Michael, this was the moment he realized compliance was not a destination. It was an ongoing process. A product that satisfies one set of requirements today may need adjustments tomorrow as regulations evolve and market expectations change. This creates an entirely different type of operational challenge. Companies are not simply managing formulas and packaging. They are managing information. They must monitor updates, maintain records, communicate with suppliers, and ensure that products continue meeting applicable standards as laws develop over time. Large corporations invest heavily in systems designed specifically for this purpose. They employ regulatory specialists whose job is to track changes before those changes become problems. Smaller businesses often do not have that luxury. Instead, they rely on consultants, industry associations, legal advisors, and internal processes to stay informed. The hidden cost is not always money. Sometimes it is time. A company may spend months evaluating whether a new ingredient can be used, whether packaging needs revisions, or whether certain claims remain appropriate under changing guidance. None of this work is visible to consumers. Customers walk into a store, place a bottle in their shopping cart, and continue with their day. They never see the meetings, reviews, documentation, and decision-making processes happening behind the scenes. Yet those invisible activities often determine whether a product successfully remains on the market. By this stage, Michael had crossed multiple gatekeepers and learned an important lesson. The companies that survive long-term are not necessarily the ones with the most innovative formulas. They are often the ones with the strongest systems for managing complexity. And that becomes especially clear when businesses make mistakes. Because the next gatekeeper does not focus on products that succeed. It focuses on what happens when companies get compliance wrong. By the time Michael Carter reached this stage, he had stopped viewing compliance as a checklist. He now understood it as a risk management system designed to prevent problems before they happen. The reason became obvious when he started studying what occurs when companies make mistakes. Most people assume regulatory issues begin with major failures. In reality, many start with something far smaller. A claim that could not be fully supported. A labeling detail that was overlooked. A supplier document that was incomplete. A process that was not properly documented. Individually, these issues may appear minor. But in highly regulated industries, small problems can create large consequences. When questions arise, companies are often asked to provide evidence. Not opinions. Not assumptions. Evidence. They must demonstrate how decisions were made, how products were evaluated, and how requirements were addressed. Businesses that maintain strong documentation systems can respond quickly and confidently. Businesses without those systems often find themselves scrambling to reconstruct information after the fact. That difference can determine whether an issue remains manageable or becomes a costly distraction. What surprised Michael was that many successful companies treat compliance failures the same way pilots treat safety incidents. Every mistake becomes a learning opportunity. Processes are reviewed. Procedures are updated. Systems are strengthened. The goal is not perfection. The goal is continuous improvement. This philosophy explains why mature manufacturers invest so heavily in quality management. They understand that preventing problems is almost always less expensive than solving them later. A few hours spent reviewing documentation today may prevent weeks of disruption tomorrow. A careful packaging review may avoid a costly product revision. A thorough supplier evaluation may prevent future complications throughout the supply chain. The hidden lesson is that compliance is not merely about satisfying regulators. It is about protecting the business itself. Every safeguard exists because someone, somewhere, learned an expensive lesson. As Michael examined the companies that consistently succeeded year after year, he noticed a pattern. The strongest businesses were rarely the ones moving the fastest. They were the ones building the strongest operational foundations. And that realization led him to perhaps the most surprising discovery of all. The largest brands in the industry often gain their advantage from something consumers never notice. Not bigger factories. Not better marketing. Not even better formulas. Their real advantage comes from the systems operating behind the scenes. The deeper Michael Carter looked into the industry, the more he realized that the biggest companies were playing a completely different game. Consumers often assume major brands dominate because they have larger advertising budgets, stronger distribution networks, or more recognizable names. Those advantages certainly help. But behind the scenes, another factor quietly separates industry leaders from everyone else. Systems. The most successful manufacturers build processes that allow compliance, quality control, product development, supplier management, and documentation to operate consistently at scale. Instead of relying on individual memory, they rely on procedures. Instead of solving the same problem repeatedly, they create frameworks that prevent the problem from occurring in the first place. Every formula change is documented. Every supplier is evaluated. Every packaging revision is reviewed. Every customer complaint is tracked. Every process has an owner and a record. To an outsider, this may sound bureaucratic. To a large manufacturer, it is a competitive advantage. These systems create predictability. They reduce risk. They help companies expand into new markets without losing control of quality or compliance. Michael noticed something surprising when speaking with experienced industry professionals. Very few of them described compliance as an obstacle. Instead, they viewed it as infrastructure. Just as a factory needs equipment and a warehouse needs inventory, a modern product company needs systems. Without them, growth becomes difficult. With them, growth becomes manageable. This perspective completely changed how Michael viewed the business. He originally thought the product itself would be the primary driver of success. Over time, he realized that the product was only one piece of a much larger machine. Behind every bottle on a store shelf exists a network of suppliers, documentation, testing records, quality procedures, regulatory reviews, packaging controls, and operational standards working together. Consumers rarely notice this hidden architecture because it operates quietly in the background. Yet it is often the reason trusted brands remain trusted year after year. The companies that last are not simply selling formulas. They are managing systems capable of supporting those formulas at scale. And after passing through every gatekeeper, Michael finally arrived at a conclusion that challenged everything he believed when he first entered the industry. The product may be what customers buy, but it is the invisible system behind the product that determines who survives, who grows, and who disappears. Looking back on everything he learned, Michael Carter realized that his biggest misconception was believing this industry revolved around products. Like many entrepreneurs, he entered the market focused on formulas, fragrances, packaging, and performance. Those things matter. But they are not the foundation. The foundation is the system that supports them. Every gatekeeper he encountered pointed toward the same lesson. Success is rarely determined by a single breakthrough. It is built through processes that create consistency, accountability, and trust. The most important lesson was understanding that compliance is not the enemy of innovation. It is part of the infrastructure that allows innovation to reach consumers responsibly. Without standards, documentation, testing, and oversight, trust becomes difficult to maintain. And without trust, long-term growth becomes difficult to achieve. If Michael could go back to the beginning, he would spend less time obsessing over the product itself and more time understanding the environment surrounding it. He would learn the rules earlier. He would build documentation systems sooner. He would create operational procedures before growth forced him to. Most importantly, he would recognize that compliance is not something a company adds later. It is something a company builds into its foundation from day one. For anyone considering entering this industry, that may be the most valuable takeaway. Do not view regulations as obstacles standing in your way. View them as realities that must be understood. The companies that succeed are not necessarily the companies with the most resources. They are often the companies willing to learn how the system actually works. Because behind every bottle sitting on a retail shelf is a story that consumers never see. A story of documentation, verification, testing, reviews, procedures, and continuous oversight. What appears simple on the outside is supported by an extraordinary amount of invisible work on the inside. And perhaps that is the final surprise. The real product is not just the liquid inside the bottle. The real product is trust. Trust that the product performs as expected. Trust that it was developed responsibly. Trust that the company behind it understands its obligations. In the end, that invisible system is not merely protecting consumers. It is quietly determining which businesses earn the right to remain on the shelf year after year.